I'm grateful to know that the member still believes that the globe is running Canada, but it's not. It's not. It's my responsibility to protect the interests of this province, and I'll continue to do that. I don't give a damn what the Globe and Mail says.
I've got Canada in my pocket, a little bit of history. A penny and a nickel and a quarter and a dime mean a lot to you and me. It's more than pocket money, they're the symbols of our land. They're pictures of important things for which this country stands.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is April 12th, 2018, and this is episode 81. Politicos is your weekly politics recap with a West Coast perspective. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicos.
I'm Scott Leinboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. We don't have to talk about the speculation tax this week. I thought we were going to have new legislation to talk about, but no, we have a Kinder Morgan pipeline trade dispute because they decided to blow up BC politics. So we're going to cover that for most of our show. But then we have a interesting interview with criminal lawyer Kyla Lee, who talks about issues with BC's impaired driving legislation and what might be coming up with cannabis impaired driving legislation that raises constitutional issues. So stay tuned for that. First, we have to thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Tedds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. And as always, I'll remind you that Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, BC's brand new daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to British Columbia politics. Sign up for your free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners receive 25% off when you enter the offer code Politicos. For your free 2-week trial, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. All right, for our main segment, let the Western bastards freeze in the dark. Sunday evening, we probably should have just done an emergency podcast, but you're busy, I'm busy, it didn't happen, and we kind of wanted to see how this shook out. Kinder Morgan announces they're putting an immediate stop on all non-essential work on their TransMountain pipeline. This was their way of putting an ultimatum to the BC government to, in its paraphrased words, stop fucking around, and to the federal government to, I don't know, clear the path, as it were. And since then, everything seems to have kind of exploded and caught on fire.
Yeah. Within the span of a week, we started speculating about emergency acts and constitutional crises. It's been a hell of a week.
Alberta's Rachel Notley has reacted over the top. I don't know. She's got to do what she's got to do. She's pitched everything from getting the federal government to cut off BC's transfer payments to nationalizing or making Alberta an investor in Kinder Morgan and getting the federal government to have the army patrol the construction through British Columbia. This has been a weird week.
Yeah, and I'm guessing when the NDP base talked about nationalizing the energy system, buying a stake in a pipeline isn't what they mean.
No, I have lots of left and NDP supporting friends in Alberta, the kind who aren't big fans of pipelines like this one, even though they're in Alberta. And they're just like, oh, now we're talking about nationalization? Where were you any time in the last couple of years? Let's maybe start with Kinder Morgan. Why make this move and why put this ultimatum forward?
Well, to put some pressure on the governments, basically, threaten to cut off all of these jobs, throw a little fuel on the fire, get the squabbling back up, and try and force the federal government to step in and say, no, this is a federally regulated project. We're a country, not a collection of provincial fiefdoms. Let it go through.
For me, it's almost that's their obvious and sort of vocal strategy. I'm almost wondering if the project had been sitting on the edge of financially feasible for a while, and the delays, both from previous National Energy Board debates and the ongoing uncertainty around it, plus still somewhat low oil prices, have made them going, I don't know if we really need to do this. And so strategically, by launching this ultimatum, they're able to just basically put it to the province of Alberta and the federal government to say, if you want to make this go through, make it easy. It's kind of the corporatist dream of just like having, like, I can't imagine being in the Kinder Morgan boardroom when a government is like openly musing of investing in you. Like, just here's free money.
Normally your last name has to be Bombardier before that happens.
And so it feels to me like just a cynical ploy from them to try to like get concessions from the governments, stop fighting us, just like let us have everything we want.
That might be a little too cynical.
It's a cynical era. But if it's been on the edge and BC has been talking about using every tool in the toolbox, they clearly want to put pressure on BC, and Kinder Morgan can fight in the courtroom, but they had to do something in the political battle. And so here they really managed to turn up the heat on the federal government to really try to get this through and show if Trudeau is actually committed to it. And so I'm not convinced Kinder Morgan was at the breaking point, but maybe they just didn't want to keep fucking around and they just wanted to see if they can let the governments fight the battle for them. Instead of Kinder Morgan having to make the argument for Kinder Morgan's pipeline, they're going to let Alberta and Canada do their dirty work.
Does save on communications personnel if you can rope in the government to do that work for you.
So after the announcement earlier this week, I think it was Tuesday or Monday, the federal cabinet has this emergency cabinet meeting where they discuss what they're going to do. And I think the best part coming out of there was they didn't tell anyone anything about what they discussed. And so you had minister after minister being asked by the media, so what are your negotiations going to be? They're like, we don't negotiate in the open. And then they literally ran from the media. You had Finance Minister Morneau and Resources Minister, I believe, Carr, running from the media in somewhat embarrassing ways, which is not a good look for a government that's trying to show that it's behind this pipeline. Meanwhile, John Horgan on the other side has just been able to go, I'm standing up for BC's coast. I think the most extreme PR on this was Trudeau today releasing this video on Twitter of him that he'd recorded 2 weeks ago when he was out in BC and didn't actually talk to the media or hold a town hall or anything. Well, his last town hall here went very poorly, so maybe that's why. But he's on the water talking about his ocean protection plan and why this pipeline is necessary to like match his spill response thing. And it's just bad PR. Like, I feel like Trudeau's at this point almost throwing his BC MPs to the wolves because he's pretty much pit BC against Canada.
I'm not sure so much he pit them against Canada. That's just kind of how it's shaken out. But for better or ill, he's definitely wedded to the pipeline now.
And there is a portion of BC that is in favor of it. The Andrew Wilkinson and the BC Liberals have been championing that in the legislature all week, screaming bloody murder in every question period since the legislature returned on Monday.
Yeah, and you have people that range from the, I don't really like pipelines, but I also don't like provinces usurping federal authority. People who are like...
Do those people exist?
I've run into a few of them.
Okay. Because I know the opposite exists. I don't want the federal government stepping on my province, but I don't want my province stepping on the federal government. I feel like
I think Andrew Coyne's written at least 5 columns on this in his career.
So there's Coyne, there's the
and I have encountered less well-known people here who have that same general view.
Okay.
They exist, but yeah, so you have those people, you have I actually just really like pipelines people, you have the not thrilled about the pipeline, but just pro-business in general, which you've seen some business groups come forward advocating for the pipeline.
And I've seen a poll thrown around a few times that showed BC is kind of split down the middle on the pipeline with like 22% somewhat supportive and 22% somewhat opposed. But I think that's at least a few months old. And I feel like this last week is going to hyperpolarize BC and the country.
Yeah, and it's probably also a bit of our political bubbles is that we live in Metro Vancouver. We're tuned into politics here, and it's a loud group of people opposing the pipeline here. And You just don't necessarily hear from the person in Prince George who kind of supports the pipeline but doesn't feel super strongly about it. So I think the disconnect between our perception and the poll numbers probably explained by that.
Sure, and I'd be interested in new polls, which I'm sure will happen soon. I know friend of the pod, Mario Canseco, just launched a new company today called Research Co., which is a perfect name for a public opinions company. Mario, if you're listening, do a poll on Kinder Morgan and let us know what the people think. One of the other things that came up this week around this was a few weeks ago, there was this protest where Elizabeth May and Kennedy Stewart were speaking out against the pipeline, and they were both arrested, and they faced their first appearance before a court. And the judge in that first hearing decided that he would tell the province, I believe it is, that they should both face criminal rather than just civil charges. And I don't know if that has any precedent to take a sitting elected official in Canada, probably from the BC 1920s, when you had almost communists elected at times, and they probably got arrested. But since then, I can't think of any.
There's probably some precedent from 1820 in Ontario or something like that.
Or there is the someone stole a thing, or Derek Fildebrandt actually just faced some charges, but I don't think those were criminal. The hunting charges.
Honestly, he's faced so many issues. I can't keep track of them all,
but they rarely relate to not your duty as an MP, but doing a political thing. So if a elected official is doing something political, like attending a protest, and they get arrested, it feels weird to have them then face criminal charges. And maybe I'm just a little too sympathetic to them at this point, or sympathetic to the idea of protest in general. But we'll find out on Monday if they do face criminal charges, or if they're just going to face some civil contempt of court orders and injunctions. But maybe let's turn to some of the various responses that are being pitched to the federal government and by the provincial governments. We touched on Notley buying up shares in Kinder Morgan on behalf of Alberta. And my favorite part of that I'll just add is that Jason Kenney and the United Conservative Party endorsed it. So we live in the twilight zone now, where the most right-wing party in the country, the Alberta Conservatives, are in favor of nationalizing a key industry, in their opinion, because they can't say no to anything the NDP pitches in terms of supporting this pipeline. As I mentioned, they also suggested cutting off transfer payments, and right now BC gets about $6.9 billion from the federal government. And I think we should just take a second and actually explain what equalization payments are, because they are the most misunderstood thing in Canadian politics.
Yeah, so the equalization system works is from general revenues in Ottawa. A check gets cut to a bunch of the provincial governments whose per capita GDP, I think, a few other metrics that go into this complicated formula that factors in royalties from resource extraction and everything, and that goes to the provincial governments to spend. And it's often described as Alberta paying Ottawa this money that then gets used for equalization, where in fact it's the GST, your income taxes, those sorts of things get put into just the big pot of money that a little bit of it goes to equalization.
Yeah, so every province, in theory, can receive equalization payments.
And in fact, I believe every province has at one point or another.
So the lever they're trying to look at is not so much stopping Alberta's money coming to BC, because BC is not actually receiving equalization. We're receiving some of the social payouts and some of the healthcare payouts.
Yeah, so there's three big transfers that the federal government makes to provinces. The equalization is one, but there's also the social transfer that's supposed to go to stuff like education and all sorts of social programs. We did about $1.8 billion for that. And then there's the health transfer, which is supposed to go to, healthcare. And that amounts to $5.1 billion. So overall, we're looking at nearly $7 billion of money here. And that's a big chunk of the BC budget. For reference were 52 billion, somewhere in that range per year. So, blow a huge chunk in our budget for sure.
Yeah, because if you'll remember back to our budget episode, we're sitting around balance. Like the NDP projects a small surplus of a couple $100 million, but with some fudge factors in there. But if you dropped a couple billion out of there, even if the government was just like holding back a little bit, we'd have a giant hole in our budget.
Yeah, and the question of how to resolve MSP, which is only $2 billion, there's a whole task force set up for that. And it was a big question of how do you close that revenue gap, and that's nothing compared to this one.
Of course, there's no actual guarantee that the federal government taking such unilateral action would be constitutional, or follow the rule of law, since it would seem kind of just arbitrary that they turned BC's money off and didn't churn. Well, I guess the term rule of law has come up a lot this week.
Yeah, no, my knowledge of the British North America Act isn't that great, but I'm pretty sure these programs are just established by statute. So in theory, Parliament could pass a law and, the Senate might eventually pass it 3 years later and cut it all off.
Some of the other suggestions get even more complicated. One of the simplest that we know is happening is on Monday, Alberta is introducing Bill 12, which is the basically turn off the taps bill, which we talked about the wine war earlier this year, where Alberta stopped importing BC wine. Well, now it looks like they may stop exporting Alberta oil and gas to BC, and our gas prices might go from the $1.50 to $1.55 they are right now to $2, $3, who knows? Maybe we just won't have gasoline anymore. Analysts predict that Alberta turning down the taps could range from, because we don't know exactly what their bill will say, and they're being a little bit cagey other than to say we'll face restrictions. We could face increasing prices of 10 cents to like 60 cents, seeing gas prices go up to $2 a liter. I think no one really knows exactly what will happen, because this has never really been done before. It also raises those same flags about the absurdity of Canada's internal free trade, as the wine war did, since one province can apparently maybe just tell another, we're not going to give you this product anymore.
Yeah, this whole thing is just being a little absurd in that, from one province saying, no, you can't buy from us, to another province saying, yeah, we're not going to let the primary export of one of our neighboring provinces pass through our province. Like, the whole thing is very much emblematic of, like I said earlier, provincial fiefdoms rather than a country.
Well, and then the last two national tools that I've heard bandied about were that the government should invoke, I think it's Section 92 of the British North America Act, the Constitution Act, that is like the disallowance section, which just allows the federal government to literally stamp on provincial jurisdiction and just say, this is what we're doing now. And I think there actually is a bill that one backbencher senator introduced to make this happen, and it's like going to second reading, and he likes to defend it that it's been used 400 times in history, but none of those times are before 1950, and most of them were to push the railways through. Railways have a great history in this country anyway, but that one's probably not going anywhere. But who knows? The other tool the federal government has is the Emergencies Act, which was formerly named the War Measures Act, which was most infamously invoked by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, to suspend civil liberties and invoke martial law pretty much in Quebec as a response to the FLQ crisis. So we're in great territory here.
I think the chance the feds using that are pretty much zero.
So, as we've said all along, the political incentives for every party in this fight are to just basically keep doing what they're doing. John Horgan has his environmental activist base, if you want, but he's also got the Green Party holding him up, and they don't like this pipeline. So he's not going to lose popularity by giving into the feds. If anything, the Western provinces are built on the idea of saying fuck you to the federal government.
Well, that is a little less pronounced in BC than it is Alberta or in Saskatchewan.
Sure. And Rachel Notley is coming up on an election in about a year and has now staked her career on this. I think there's a good argument that she is never going to win on pipelines versus a conservative. People in Alberta who are really passionate about the oil industry there are always going to pick the true oil supporters over the like shady ones. So it almost makes me wonder why she thought she could build this long-term NDP coalition and why she didn't just almost like Dave Barrett it, like just go, fuck it, we're gonna, go hard and go socialist, and even if we go home, we'll have done the things we wanted. But she's on the path she's on now.
Yeah, and when she got elected, the right was split in Alberta. The PCs were having oh my God, we're just out of power. Half the party has only been alive during our reign. And the Alberta right was a bit in shambles at the time. And there was a very real chance that if that continued, Rachel Notley could have built up a NDP government that could viably contest the next couple elections without as strong an opposition as she's likely to face now. But to do that, you need to hold on to those kind of centrist, center-right voters who were pretty fed up with the PCs, went NDP. And to do that, she needed to bridge the gap there and do something for the oil industry while also bringing in a carbon price and some new environmental measures. So from the vantage point of 2015, the path she chose made a lot of sense.
Then, of course, you have like Jagmeet Singh, who is taking the just let the courts decide approach.
Which is a little non-committal from a politician. And not only that, the courts are almost certainly going to side with the federal government on this one.
Well, there's something like 6 or more ongoing court cases. We're trying to figure out the exact number, but there's plenty of lawsuits involving Kinder Morgan, but there's plenty of lawsuits involving any major corporation. The BC government hasn't actually finalized its reference question yet that we want to ask about this jurisdiction. So there's at least one more court case to come. The one thing that hasn't really been brought up and we haven't touched on is the Indigenous claims and the Indigenous sovereignty claims, especially near the end of the line. Kinder Morgan likes to talk about the number of groups they have brought on side, but that only works for the parts of the pipeline that goes to. If you get 2/3 of the pipeline, but a third still disagrees with it, do you just like loop around their territory? Well, that's not what they're planning to do. They just want to twin the thing. So there are still, I think, open court questions that aren't necessarily as clear cut as this is guaranteed federal sovereignty, but we're going to be talking about this for a while since there's at least 2 more major things happening next week with Alberta's bill to turn off the taps and the decision about whether Elizabeth May is facing criminal charges.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. This interlude from Kinder Morgan brought to you by the BC Greens.
Well, we have with us Kyla Lee, criminal defense lawyer, who is well known for speaking out on driving under the influence and issues around that. Welcome to Politicoast.
Thanks for having me.
Kyla, maybe you can run us down why this is such a passion. So people get pulled over who are drunk and driving. What penalties do they even face right now?
Well, in British Columbia, the penalties that they're facing for impaired driving is a 90-day driving prohibition, a 30-day vehicle impound, and they have to pay for the towing and storage costs. There's also a $500 fine, a $250 license reinstatement fee, and as of March 2016, a mandatory alcohol education course, and potentially, depending on the record, a mandatory interlock in the vehicle for 6 months or more.
And is that pretty standard for Canada?
It's not. Every province has sort of different administrative schemes. Alberta just, beginning of this week actually, adopted their administrative scheme that really mirrors what we have here. A couple years ago, Ontario had their legislation passed to pass a similar one. So we're sort of seeing this become standard across Canada. But it used to just be the criminal code, and you would have sort of the standard criminal code, criminal charges across the country, and the provinces have sort of said, we don't like the way these are tying up the courts and clogging up the system, and we think too many drunk drivers are getting off. So they created their own administrative laws.
So as far as I understand what the broad issue is here, when people are being stopped at a roadside check or the police pull you over and you blow over, what's the limit in BC? 0.05?
Well, it's 0.05 for an administrative prohibition and then 0.08 for a longer administrative prohibition or a criminal charge.
And so if you blow over that, they have the chance to seize your car on the spot.
Yep.
How do you get your car back then?
There's only one way, and that's by filing an application for review with the Superintendent of Motor Vehicles and going through this really strange review process with adjudicators and administrative law where your charter rights only kind of matter and really not really at all, and you don't have any procedural rights. There's no cross-examination or compelling disclosure. It's all very artificial.
So why doesn't the charter apply in this case?
Because the government gets to sort of opt out of the charter when they do anything under administrative law. Basically, tribunals only have the powers the government gives them. And so if they don't have the power to give a charter remedy, then they can't give a charter remedy.
And I imagine people are trying to fight this.
Yes, a lot of people try to fight their prohibitions, although surprisingly far fewer than receive them. The overall dispute rate's about 20% of people who get them actually dispute them. So that number's always surprised me because of the amount of things that can go wrong at the roadside. But the dispute process, as I said, it's very artificial and it's also really constrained.
And the NDP has criticized in the past these issues with the administration of this and the delays, I take it.
Yes, there was quite a famous case where an individual had been waiting 2 years for his decision for his IRP is what it's called, review hearing, and he didn't get a decision. He went to court to try and force the superintendent to render a decision, and in the process of that, it was revealed that there was this huge backlog in decision making, that there were about 1,500 people who'd been waiting years for decisions, and the government was doing nothing to sort of hurry it along.
So people are basically waiting longer for their appeal decision than their actual punishment.
Yes, and longer than they would wait in court with, the Jordan decision from the Supreme Court of Canada and the timelines for delay. So you have these people who are getting administrative penalties who are going through this whole process, and in the meantime also have it on their driving record because you're presumed guilty until you prove yourself innocent, and they wait years for a decision.
And has the government taken any action to deal with that backlog?
No, they haven't. And it's been so frustrating for me and so disappointing. The previous government, this legislation was introduced by the BC Liberal government. It was, sort of their road safety baby. And I think it bought them a lot of votes in a previous election. But it was also the subject of a lot of criticism, in particular by Mike Farnworth, who's now the Solicitor General, because of the flaws identified by the courts, the backlog and their failure to address this, and the limitations on the ability of people to apply for review. And so he called out Mike Morris in the legislature and said, you need to fix these things. The court says fix them. You need to do it. And, unsurprisingly, I think the BC Liberal government never did. And now that they're out and the NDP is in and Mike Farnworth has the job, I had hoped that he would do it, but it appears that there's been absolutely no action.
What does he do? Or what does he need to do?
I don't know what he does. He's not fixing the IRP scheme.
What are the steps the government could take? Is it just a matter of throwing money at it?
No, it's not even a matter of throwing money at it. It's a simple legislative amendment that would require adjudicators to give reasons for why they're extending decisions, and a simple legislative amendment that would allow people to apply for review beyond sort of the 7-day period. So if you get one of these 90-day roadside prohibitions, you've got only 7 days, no exceptions under any circumstances to file for review. You go to jail, doesn't matter. You get in a car accident and you're in a coma, doesn't matter. You don't get an extension. And all they have to do is write literally 2 more sentences in the Motor Vehicle Act to fix this.
Why is it limited to that 7 days?
I don't really know. From what I've seen, my best guess is that they think that if they make it longer than 7 days, there's going to be this flood of applications from people who drag their heels. But we don't see that in other contexts. And the courts talked about this too when dealing with fresh evidence applications in the IRP scheme. You don't see a lot of people going to the court to dispute their traffic ticket where the time limit is 30 days and saying, oh, I missed my 30 days and now I want a late dispute. There's not that many applications for that. There's not that many people out there applying for extensions of the time to appeal their decisions after they've been convicted in court. And so the reasoning that they're using doesn't really play out when you look at other circumstances where extensions of things are allowed.
So you mentioned the one court case that let us know that there's this huge backlog. Did that not result in some like court orders to force the government to do
No,
things?
There was a court order in that specific case to tell the government to render a decision within a certain time frame in that case. And as a result of the court order there, all of the other matters that had these sort of indefinite, we'll get you a decision when we get to it, got a date certain for a decision. But it didn't solve the problem of the huge period of time. They just, now you knew how long the period of time was going to be instead of just wondering, which might have been less stressful for the drivers, but it's still, it's justice delayed is justice denied. And it's still perpetuating that problem. And nobody knew why either. And there's all these different challenges that have come with respect to the delay. People arguing that the government has a challenge before the courts and they're waiting for the law to change. And judges were like, well, that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I can't say that's happening, but the appearance of it isn't great. And none of it has really been resolved. There's still frequent extensions and multiple extensions in these cases.
Did you have anything else to add on alcohol impaired driving?
Not on alcohol impaired driving, but more like on the line of government hypocrisy.
Sure.
Just because, I just feel like it's another example, and I know you guys had talked about this on the podcast 2 weeks ago on your episode about Nanaimo, but you were also talking about the government ads and how the NDP was criticizing the Liberals when they were in power for partisan ads, and now we see all these, arguably partisan ads paid for by the NDP government. And this is just another example of them, jumping on a bandwagon to criticize something that's going to get them votes, but then not taking action when the time comes. And as a citizen and somebody who voted for them, it leaves me disappointed.
Well, one of the big things they've argued is that there's this big cannabis legislation coming up to help basically make BC's regulatory regime. And so they haven't apparently had time to write a lot of other bills other than the few things they wrote in the fall and the spring. First couple weeks they passed their budget. In this past week, we've seen the legislature sit a few days and we've still not really seen any interesting bills come forward, like some tweaks and changes here. So maybe all their attention's focused on the cannabis legislation that they say is very complicated. But that I want to use as a pivot point to talk about what I know you're very worried about, and I imagine a lot of other civil liberties lawyers in your situation are, is drug-impaired driving is going to be a new criminal offense, and BC's probably looking at similar regulatory issues. Maybe talk us through what's coming as far as you know, and where the red flags there are.
Yes, there are quite a few red flags in each of there's sort of three streams the government could choose to deal with the problem of drug-impaired driving, which I say is not as big a problem as they're making it out to be. The three streams are saliva testing, the SFSTs, so standardized field sobriety tests, and then the drug recognition evaluation. And all of them have sort of their own inherent problems. Some are going to be more reliable than others. The more testing and the more time you spend with an individual, the more likely you are as an officer to get a good sense of their level of impairment. So in that way, the drug recognition evaluation, which is a 12-step program, and that's not an accidental number of steps, designed to...
How many of those steps involve praying to God, though?
None of them involve praying to God unless you're the officer and you're praying that when you interview the subject, they're going to admit that they used heroin an hour before driving or something like that. But it's 12 steps. It was designed deliberately to plant that in the minds of juries in the United States. But it takes such a long time to administer that as a roadside tool for a quick administrative driving type scheme, it's not very useful. And it's also very easy for officers to screw it up. And if you put it in an administrative context, you need to, the Supreme Court of Canada said in the challenges to the drunk driving legislation, have this opportunity to challenge the results of the test. And if you screw it up, you can't challenge it.
How does the test work, in other words?
The drug recognition evaluation? Yes. Well, you go through a number of steps. There's physical coordination tests, divided attention tests, and a bunch of really strange physical examinations. An officer basically pretends to be a doctor for a period of time. So they'll look at your pupil size and they'll measure it with a pupilometer, but it's not actually a pupilometer. It's literally a card that has different sizes on it, and then
if
you're supposed to guess.
So there's a
exactly
bit of subjectiveness in it.
It's 100% subjective. And when you have police who are trained to look for things and say that they are consistent with impairment, rather than look for things and say, well, is that impairment, or is this person slurring their words because they have false teeth, or whatever the case may be, you're going to interpret everything you see as consistent with drug impairment when maybe it's not.
Well, and anytime there's a bit of subjectivity in the police force, we tend to find that overlaps with racial bias and other issues, I imagine.
It does, yes. And I mean, you see that with traffic stops, right? The decisions that officers are making to pull people over are often, not all the time, but often motivated either by unconscious or conscious bias. I mean, it's been a huge problem with carting in Toronto. It's been a huge problem in Saskatchewan in particular with interactions with Indigenous people. And in BC, we have such a significant South Asian population and a significant Asian population that are often the target of sort of police activity, and it's rife for abuse, and it's rife for unconscious abuse, which is just a form of abuse.
Well, I'll just squeeze in. I'll note that there is an ongoing, I think it closes Monday, government consultation, as there are many, on unconscious bias in policing. So at least that part they're looking at. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's some interesting proposals. I'll send you the link.
Yes, please.
So we talked about one test. What are the other two tests? What are the issues with them?
So the other two are the SFST and saliva testing. SFST is I think the easiest to rule out as useful, because all of the validation studies that have been done for it, none of which are peer-reviewed, have only been done for alcohol. And it says, this test is useful at detecting alcohol impairment. It's not useful for drugs. And when NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Association, was actually developing it, their original plan was to use it for drugs, and specifically marijuana, and they realized as they did it that it doesn't work for marijuana. The first step of the test is looking for horizontal gaze nystagmus, which is involuntary jerking of the eye. And you don't see that with cannabis. So 1/3 of the test is useless. And so it's not going to be feasible for dealing with the problem that they think is going to exist, which leaves us with saliva testing. And that is inherently problematic. You have devices that are susceptible to cold temperatures and hot temperatures that can only be used in an operating temperature range of 5 to 25 degrees Celsius for one of them and 15 to 25 degrees Celsius for another. It's not even 15 degrees today, and it's the loveliest day we've had all year.
And like you're saying, that's a range that Vancouver tends to sit in, with some outliers.
Prince George, on the other hand?
Yep. Prince George, Dawson Creek, Cache Creek, often the hottest place in the province, or Lillooet.
Yeah, and Kelowna, and pretty much everywhere except Metro Vancouver, the Lower Mainland.
Which is great.
Island.
I mean, just everybody in BC is guilty except the people in the Lower Mainland. That would work.
Or it just means a lot more, I guess, work for you on the good side, but a lot more time in court challenge or in these administrative tribunals challenging these tests.
Yeah. And more delay to rendering decisions and less justice for people. And if they do anything similar to the IRP scheme, they're going to put the burden on the driver to show that things were wrong. Well, how do you prove information that you can't necessarily get, like the manufacturer's temperature range for the device? Or how do you prove that of 100 cases that you get as a lawyer, 7 of them are false readings because these devices have been studied and have a 7% false positive rate? How do you prove which 7 are actually innocent people? There's no way to do that. And so it puts people in the position of having to meet an impossible burden and obtain evidence that could never exist.
7% seems really high. Is there a legal standard on how error-prone a device or test can be before it's inadmissible?
There's no legal standard. The Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences will set guidelines, and they've largely been sort of adopted by courts. For example, the Supreme Court of Canada and Saint-Onge-Lamoureux said that, their guidelines about approved instruments were useful measurement for whether breath testing was reliable. But in the study that the CSFS did on saliva testing, they specifically said don't use it on its own to impose lengthy administrative sanctions because of these reliability concerns. And then when the feds did their own pilot project, they said the Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences has already determined these devices are reliable. But that's not what they said.
So is there a better model that we could use to go after or to tackle drug-impaired driving? I know a few states have legalized cannabis, and like Netherlands, for example. Are any of them doing anything good that we should look to?
I don't know that any of them are doing anything good. Lots of states and countries are using sort of the nanograms per milliliter of blood standard. So having a certain amount of THC in your blood means that you're impaired, which is flawed because the science behind that says it's not about the THC level in your blood. It's about sort of whether you're feeling the effects of it, and you can have a ton of THC in your blood and not be impaired. It gets stored in your fat cells.
I'm also guessing they aren't doing roadside blood tests either.
Well, they do in the United States. They do blood draws in the back of police cars, and it's caused all sorts of problems. Or they'll do them at the detachment. There's a really awful video, if you ever want to watch it on YouTube, of police officers in a police station holding a person down and forcibly taking their blood. It's violent and it's awful. And they have these no refusal laws, like we do in Canada, which basically let them do that.
That raises all kinds of new other charter issues, yes. I imagine.
Well, as I understand, even though part of Bill C-46 from the feds is to allow police the opportunity to take blood testing, as I understand, the RCMP isn't going to do it because it's such a huge officer safety risk, and because it's so susceptible to a constitutional challenge because of the way that it could be used to basically physically abuse people.
Do you see other issues coming up with the cannabis legalization, at least in terms of impaired driving?
I think my biggest concern about it is this notion of the boogeyman, that, we have legalization and then all of a sudden there's going to be a huge spike in cannabis impaired driving. And you look at the states where there's been legalization, and a lot of the task force reports that have been funded by these police organizations or anti-cannabis organizations say, oh, there's an increase in this. But there's also a corresponding increase in officers out there looking for cannabis impairment, people who are tested for cannabis in their bodies, people who are tested for it after fatal collisions, and officers who are trained to do the test to get this information. So, I mean, it's like you're saying, all of a sudden, when you release a bunch of mosquitoes into the air, there's more mosquitoes here and we don't know why, but it's got to be the fault of some other source. Well, no, you put them there. You put the problem there. And so as far as I'm concerned, the so-called marijuana impaired drivers are already out there. It's just the police aren't equipped to catch them. And you can even see that, like the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police have said to Ottawa, we're not ready, and they want more time because nobody's trained. So we know they're falling through the cracks, and yet we're not all dying. So I don't know.
The last bit I want to touch on is ICBC's in this disaster of a mess. And so David Eby, the MLA for this district, actually, with literally everything else on his plate, is tasked with fixing it. So he's trying to come up with solutions. And one of the things he talked about recently was cracking down on distracted drivers. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about what his proposal is and if that has any flags for you? There's
I think sort of two proposals that have been bandied about. One is the notion of giving like short roadside prohibitions to people who are using their cell phones while driving. And the other one is canceling people's insurance. So if you're in an accident and it's determined that you're using your phone, you have to pay for your own medical bills, your own costs associated with that. And it's absolute nonsense. I don't know how it's going to be possible for the government to impose legislation that does that. I can't imagine a circumstance in which the police are going to be able to obtain the information lawfully that somebody was using their phone while they were driving and that's what caused the accident, in order for ICBC to breach them. They would have to write legislation that allows ICBC to obtain cell phone records. And then even then, you don't know whether somebody was using it hands-free or whether they were doing some type of dictation for a text message or whatever the case may be. But we also have these huge privacy concerns with respect to cell phones. The Supreme Court of Canada late last year rendered a decision talking about how third parties have interests in the text messages in somebody else's phone that they've sent. And so you get into all these privacy concerns with people who aren't even involved in the collision if you start looking into cell phone records. And then the other problem is, information that, of course, our law firm got through Freedom of Information request, which was that there's not that many people dying from the cell phones on the road. Distracted driving as a category of death from a policing perspective is much broader than that. They look at, your internal distractions, like you're upset because you had a fight with your wife before you left the house, or, you don't know how you're going to pay your rent because you live in Vancouver and you don't even have a place to rent, or whatever the case may be. There's all these other types of distractions, your pets in your car, you're eating. I mean, my dad used to shave and drink his coffee while driving us to school, and we made it every day. There was one time he ran someone over, but she was fine. It was like a bump. But yeah, I mean, there's all these other types of distractions, and the government's taking no steps to outlaw those, and is only sort of dealing with it by demonizing cell phone users. And it's just, to me, another example of extract the money from the drivers rather than, identify the issue and legislate to fix it.
Well, I'm not going to ask you for the legal advice on this, but as far as I understand it, like the law as it stands right now is you can get the penalty for just like touching your phone on the dash, but you can't get a penalty for touching your radio.
That's
which
correct.
is like 2 inches away.
Yes. Yeah. It makes no sense. I mean, there's so many more distracting things. You technically couldn't get a penalty if you were using an abacus while driving, but you could get a penalty if you were using a calculator.
How do we then approach distracted driving in a more evidence-based legal framework?
I think the first thing would be to put some more common sense into the cell phone laws, take out this, this requirement that you be distracted while you're, driving because you're just touching it or because it's loose in your cup holder. You see that in some cases, or just sitting on your lap. I mean, right now it's holding it in a position in which it could be used, or not having it securely affixed to the vehicle. And you get these cases too where people get the significant penalty, the 4 points and the $368 fine for, glancing at their phone to check the time or change their music at a red light, where they're really posing no risk to anybody. And I think if we put a little bit more common sense into the law, we'd be able to identify high-risk drivers better, take those people off the road, and not overbroadly penalize people who aren't really doing much to put the public at risk.
Anything else you'd like to add or cover?
Thanks for having me.
Well, where can people find out more about you, find more of your writing? And
Okay, well, I publish a regular opinion piece in Vancouver is Awesome called Unpopular Opinion. And you can also check out my website, which is kylalee.ca. I publish a blog there. And I'm on Twitter at IRP Lawyer.
If people need a lawyer,
they can give me a call. The number is 604-685-8889. And that basically goes to me after business hours. And during business hours, you can reach my receptionist.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Moving on to Twit Takes, another MLA has unfortunately had to take medical leave as Tourism Minister Lisa Bear is out for heart surgery. So this follows fairly closely on the heels of Liberal MLA Dan Davies getting injured in a workplace accident in the interior of the province.
This is like the morbid, I didn't want this answer to the question I raised the other week about will the NDP sort of match 1-for-1 the sitting out with Dan Davies to keep the balance in the legislature. It sounds like Bear is recovering well, and will be back in the legislature in a few weeks. There's no timeline on that, but again, everyone wishes her well, and politics shouldn't come down to whether you're healthy or not. But when you have 87 people, the reality is statistically 1 or 2 are going to get sick in the course of a year or get injured or otherwise need to take leave, and hopefully they feel better soon so they can get back to debating things like Kinder Morgan. So at the Children and Youth Services Department, which has faced a lot of controversy over the years in BC, after Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond pointed out a number of systemic failings by the BC government to address specifically Indigenous youth care. Last year, Bernard Richard was appointed as the new representative to try to represent children and youth who are in foster care and other care of the government and advocate on behalf of them to the government. Turpel-Lafond had a very contentious relationship with the government, and that's well documented in Matter of Confidence, and we talked to the authors last week. Another plug for that. But Richard had come in about a year ago on this goal of trying to reconcile the agency with the government. Well, now it looks like he's already resigning. He had been appointed for a 5-year term, and he decided 1 year was possibly enough. He didn't cite anything controversial in his decision to step down. He said he just wants to return to his family in New Brunswick, and he's got a new job out there with an Indigenous group. But it does leave the NDP in the difficult position of having to find someone new by this summer for one of the most fraught positions probably in this province.
And finally, the brand new Star Vancouver, the rebrand of Metro, has reported on the donations the provincial parties have received, and the NDP's turned out they've upped their fundraising game compared to the Liberals.
So the data just came out for 2017's fundraising totals, and we'll all remember that the NDP passed the bill to ban corporate and union donations in the fall, and it took effect a bit later, and they took a lot of flack from the Greens and others for the delays on that. Well, it turns out that seemed to have worked in the NDP's interest, because the day John Horgan became premier, a lot of the big donors to the BC Liberals suddenly changed the name on those checks to BC NDP. So you had groups like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers turn off the taps, is what Star Vancouver said, to the BC Liberals and start funding the NDP. Not that that's done them any good, but over the course of the year then, it means the NDP raised $16 million to the Liberals 13.4 and the Greens 1.9. And the Greens will obviously point out that they did not accept corporate and union donations throughout that year on their principled stand. So those were just individuals. I think the biggest number for me that I took out of this was that the Liberals' donations dropped 86% after they lost power, while the NDP's rose 26%. So everyone just gave up giving money to the Liberals when they weren't in power anymore. It's almost like there was a connection between the money they were giving and what they wanted to see in legislation come out.
Yeah, well, it's pretty well known that money follows success in politics in a lot of ways. It can definitely help the campaigns and whatnot, but it's also, when you're on the upswing, when you're winning, the checks do come easier. And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.